Okay, Alexander, we have more news coming out of France, and it has to deal with the yellow vests, of course. And we have the French Prime Minister, Mr. Edouard Philippe. Once again, to all the French speakers out there, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Mm-hmm. The French Prime Minister has gave a recent interview on TV, on the French channels, and he is making the media rounds, and he says that the French government will now crack down on the yellow vest protesters. Mm-hmm. It seems that he said they're going to crack down very swiftly, very, I don't want to say violently, but very decisively. They're not going to allow any people to demonstrate. They're not going to allow any people to get on the streets. They're not going to allow any people to help the people get out on the streets to demonstrate what's going on. In previous videos, Alexander, you predicted that the Macron government, in its infinite arrogance and infinite stupidity, would double down and exacerbate the issue with yellow vests. And that seems to be exactly what's happening. What's your take on what Mr. Philippe is saying now?
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, that is exactly what they're doing. They're heading towards a route of suppression. I mean, you spoke about, violently, certainly very toughly. I mean, I think the context to understand this is that France is a country which has been traditionally very open to allowing protests, very open to freedom of speech issues. And what Edouard Philippe, who is clearly acting at Macron's instigation, is now talking about is imposing much tougher restrictions on the right to hold protests than has previously been the case in France, with very harsh penalties on those who do, and with a green light to the security forces to actually break up those protests and to clamp down on them and to arrest those who engage in them and to take legal action against them. And what he's proposing is legislation through the French Parliament to have that happen. Now, in a country as angry as France is becoming, with a government as remote and arrogant as that of France under President Macron, I think that is an incendiary line to take. I think that given the history of France, the reality is that whenever a government cracks down in that way, it is more likely to provoke violent protests than it is to actually intimidate and silence them. Because the French people will say to themselves, this government is acting in an even more anti-French way, restricting even further our traditional rights of protest and demonstration. And they will react as French people in their history have regularly done by protesting even more strongly.
Yeah. Let me read you what Philippe said. Philippe said that the government would support a new law punishing those who do not respect the requirement to declare protests, those who take part in unauthorized demonstrations, and those who arrive at demonstrations wearing face masks. So that was Philippe's statement. Let me read you now. We talked about an article that we shared before we did this show from Tom Luango, and it's actually a very good article. I'll put the link in the description down below. And what he says to Philippe's statement is this. And after I'm done reading it, you can comment on it. The translation of what Philippe said, according to Tom: "You will accept your fate as serfs to the globalist order I serve, or you will be wiped out. And this is the path that all governments choose just before they are overthrown, seeing no other option because weakness equals death in politics. The problem is that competence, not power, as Jordan Peterson continually points out, is what gives legitimacy to leaders and institutions. Our dominance hierarchies are not based on power but competence." And with this speech, Philippe joins Macron in proving he has neither.
Well, he is absolutely right. And I'm going to make a parallel now to protests which happened in another country and how very differently they were handled there. Now, these are the famous 2011 protests that took place in Russia after the parliamentary elections in that year. If you take your mind back to what happened then, the government, the authorities, negotiated with the protesters to allow them spaces and places where they could protest peacefully. And there were all kinds of agreements, tacit agreements, that went around letting that happen. President Putin also addressed the protesters' views. Counter demonstrations supporting the government were arranged, and over time, after several months, the whole thing eventually fizzled out, leaving the government looking stronger, much stronger than it had been before, with actually very, very limited violence of any kind taking place, and with the riot police not thrown in a way that would have escalated the situation. Now, that was a very strong, very competent, very self-confident government. What we're seeing in France is a government that is neither strong, competent, nor self-confident. They are taking, as Tom Luongo correctly says, the route towards suppression. Ultimately, that is going to mean violent suppression. When that happens, violent suppression is always what provokes more violence from protesters, especially in a situation as combustible as this. And all I will say is that I still personally think it is unlikely that we are going to see anything like a revolution in France. If Mr. Macron wants to create a revolution in France, he's going about it in the right way.
The Yellow Vests are protesting against the incompetence that Macron is now showing his government has. I mean, it's this incompetence, this very incompetence that the Yellow Vests are out on the streets protesting.
Exactly.
And one of the points that you made earlier in this interview, Alexander, was the fact that Macron is not even man enough. He's not even to the point of leader, of president, that he can come out and address the people. It seems to me that he's pushing Philippe out in front to do his PR dirty work.
Exactly. I mean, this is exactly so. I mean, he could do all kinds of things. He could do what de Gaulle did in 1968, which is called a parliamentary election. Well, he's not going to do that. He could go out and meet the protesters. Well, he's not doing that either. He hides in the Élysée Palace, where he makes speeches which are frankly arrogant and unpleasant lectures from gilded offices, full of golden desks and gilt on the walls, which creates a terrible impression. And and now, of course, instead of recognizing the concerns of his people, speaking about the bad situation in France and that he understands how they feel and what's happening there, he just pushes on. He tells them that he's going to carry on as before. He's going to moderate some of his economic changes, but he's going to press ahead with others. He's now doing some kind of a deal with Germany, whereby he's going to sort of give away even more of France's sovereignty by increasing defense and foreign policy cooperation with Germany in a way, as I said, that isn't popular in France. And at the same time, not really accepting that these people who are protesting against him have a legitimate point of view. Now, hiding behind the presidency and the institutions of the French state in this way may work in the short term, but it's creating problems down the line, and perhaps not so far down the line either.
Yeah, Macron is being a good errand boy for his EU boss, for his EU bosses. And he's doing exactly... EU bosses, globalist bosses, deep state. I don't know who they are. I can't.
Well, I don't disagree with that. What I was going to disagree with was I'm not sure that he's been a good errand boy. Okay. He looks to me like a bad errand boy.
Maybe he is a bad errand boy, but okay, he's executing those orders. And at the end of the day, though, from listening to you, all of this is just going to end up backfiring. On this European integration project that all these guys have dreamed up in their head, and that Macron is trying to fulfill.
Exactly. I mean, I think that they made that miscalculation before Christmas that these concessions that he did, abolishing the diesel tax, which should never have been introduced in that way anyway, abolishing the diesel tax, doing some other tweaks here. I think he thought, and I think a lot of these people thought, that after the Christmas holiday, this thing would melt away. What has happened instead is that people have come back on after the holiday. The protests have continued, and they're showing signs of growing. The reason that they are growing is because, as we said before Christmas, none of the underlying problems have been addressed, and Macron himself is going out of his way to provoke protests further by the way he is behaving. And of course, as you absolutely rightly say, what he is doing is no more, no less than what the pro-EU elite in Brussels, Frankfurt, Berlin, and indeed Paris want him to do. These people don't seem to have a reverse gear. So he is doubling down on policies that are provoking protests. The result is he is provoking even more protests, and his only solution is to bring out the riot police and possibly in the end the army. I mean, there's been talk of that. And at the same time pass all these new draconian laws which risk provoking more protests still. I mean, it's really not clever, and it shows what a bad politician he is.
Meanwhile, you have leaders in Italy who see the movement against this integration, and they see what Macron is doing, and they're jumping on the bandwagon of saying, you know what, we're going to move against the grain here, and we're not for the integration, we're for sovereignty, we're for the nation state. And these guys are starting to form a significant coalition.
I'm glad you brought this up because, of course, one of the most interesting contrasts is to see the way that Salvini, who is the de facto leader of Italy, I mean, he's not the prime minister, but he might as well be because he's the person everybody looks to. It's to see the way he interacts with ordinary people in Italy, the way he's able to move around the streets in Italy in the summer, go to the beaches, meet people there, mix with them, talk to them, and to see the way that Macron does. I mean, it is darkness and light. The contrast is so extraordinary that it explains why people are now comparing Macron with Louis XVI, the remote and distant monarch who had the misfortune, actually he was a much more sympathetic person than Macron, provoking the revolution that overwhelmed France. I mean, Louis XVI actually was a good man. Not a good king, but not a bad person. And Macron, I'm afraid, is a bad president and not a very likable person, at least not to me personally either.
Yeah, he's not a very likable figure at all. Oh, well, let's see where this goes. We're heading into the weekend. Do you think there's going to be an Act 9?
Oh yeah, I think there is, and I think all this talk is going to make it more likely. I mean, we talked about Louis XVI. Let me talk about another French king, who was Charles X. People may be familiar with Les Miserables, the musical, because of course that was provoked. The revolution you see there was provoked by the arrogance and out of touch personality of Charles X. And Charles X also tried to suppress protests violently, and it brought him down. And I suspect Macron is well on the road to doing the same thing. He won't like that comparison. Charles X is not a very well regarded figure in France. I suspect before long Macron will be seen in the same way. But will there be more protests this weekend? Undoubtedly. Will they be violent? Almost certainly, because of the way Macron is handling the situation.
Yeah, Macron, the best thing he could do for the good of the country is to step aside.
Absolutely. I mean, if nothing else, given how the situation is drifting now, if he was to say that, he's not going to reapply for re-election at the end of his term, that would diffuse the situation, I suspect, a lot. But I mean, there might be other things he could do. But the point is, he's not doing them. He is instead taking a line of confrontation, which is escalating the thing further. And can I just say one further thing? I think that Macron feels ashamed because of the concessions that he made just before Christmas in the hope that these would cause the protests to disperse. I think he has also in private been criticized for making them by some of the people you were talking about, some of the elite people who surround him and who leveraged him into power. And of course, it's those people that he listens to, not the people of France.
Yeah, those are the real people that are running France, not him.
Yeah.
All right, Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. Thank you very much. Guys, if you like this video, click on the subscribe button, smash the like button, share the Duran channel with everybody you know. Go to the Duran shop, pick up a t-shirt, donate to us on PayPal and Patreon. That really, really helps us out a lot. And of course, you can get this show on iTunes and Soundcloud audio format, and go to the Duran.com, the website, to read articles that Alexander Mercouris is linking up to. Thank you very much. Until next time, take care.